report by more than 30 international experts. They concluded that Kremlin propaganda, mass graves, destruction of cultural sites, forced relocations, and other atrocities are all part of a pattern to destroy Ukraine's national identity. The Genocide Convention of the United Nations, as a reminder, defines genocide as this: any of the following acts committed with intent to destroy, in whole or in part, a national, ethnical, racial, or religious group as such by various means. Now, the study was compiled by the Washington think tank New Lines Institute in collaboration with the Raoul Wallenberg Center for Human Rights in Canada. Emily Prey of New Lines Institute joins us now from Washington, and Yona Diamond of the Raoul Wallenberg Center is in Montreal. And thank you to you both for staying with us and waking up early to be with us. Emily, let me start with you, really the main conclusion from your report, that Russia's actions in Ukraine pose a serious risk of genocide. From what your team has seen, has genocide been committed in Ukraine? Has that legal threshold been crossed here?
What we've seen in our research for this report is that there exists a serious risk of genocide in Ukraine. As you said, Russia bears state responsibility for breaches of the Genocide Convention, for incitement to genocide, and all of this ties together to trigger the duty to prevent under international law.
But Emily, let me ask you this. I was in Ukraine. Our teams have been in Ukraine for months now. We're into the third month of this war. Teams on the ground in Bucha. I've spoken to, representatives from the UN, from Ukraine, those investigating the ground. They're going as far as calling it genocide. Why do you say serious risk of genocide while others call it genocide?
Well, genocide is it's a legal term with a very strict definition. And so this report, which as you said, over 30 of the top legal and genocide experts in the world collaborated on, came to the conclusion that there is a serious risk of genocide, but that does not lessen what is happening in any way, because under the Genocide Convention, that still triggers the duty to prevent, and that still puts pressure on states to act in accordance to international law.
And thanks for clarifying that, Emily. So give us a sense, give our viewers a sense how you and your team reached this conclusion. Talk about the research, the investigation, because obviously the point here is proving that it was Russia's intent to destroy Ukraine or Ukrainians as a group.
Absolutely. We have a team of legal experts, open source intelligence analysts, and regional experts, linguists, and translators who used everything was open source intelligence. And so states really cannot stand back and say that they didn't know what was happening. And I especially want to highlight the sexual and gender-based crimes that are taking place in Ukraine, because these types of gender-based crimes are often unreported or brushed to the side. But in this report, we dedicated a whole section to rape and sexual violence, which looks at how rape can be indicative of genocidal intent. So, for example, Ukraine's ombudswoman, Lyudmila Denisova, reported last month that Russian soldiers held a group of Ukrainian women and girls in a basement and raped them repeatedly, telling them that we will rape you until you no longer want sexual contact with any man to prevent you from having Ukrainian children. So this is a pretty clear-cut example of how rape can be indicative of genocidal intent.
It's just horrifying hearing you really lay out in the stories that I've heard on the ground and our team continues to hear. And Yona, as I was looking for the report, and your report points this out, the main purpose, of course, of the Genocide Convention is prevention. And that includes the responsibility of all 152 countries, I believe, who are signatory to this, including Russia, to intervene. So what legal action can be taken here, given Russia's veto power at the Security Council?
Yeah, that's a good question. So our assessment is looking at all the evidence with our team from, like you said, around the world, independent experts. And we reviewed all the evidence, and we came to the conclusion that Russia is breaching the Genocide Convention in multiple ways. Now, what this means for states is there's a legal obligation to prevent and to act and do everything reasonably in their power and capacity to influence the situation in order to both protect the targeted group of Ukrainians that are subject to the genocidal campaign, as well as to respond to Russia with various measures. And that's really more of a political decision, because what we've done is we've assessed the facts in an impartial and objective and independent way. And now the burden is on states and governments to determine how they will respond, considering the security situation.
Right. And so, Emily, I really want to give our viewers a sense of your findings. And I looked at, I think it was on page 20, it says, national and international investigators and analysts have documented rapidly expanding mass graves and a pattern of Ukrainian civilian corpses found with hands tied, tortured, and shot at close range. And you argue, in large part, of that report that there is considerable evidence this demonstrates that Russian soldiers have internalized state propaganda to carry out atrocities. Tell us what you found here.
Yes, there is a widespread campaign in Russia being led by the Kremlin and state propaganda to incite genocide. And so that's, the whole denazification of Ukraine falls under that. The fact that Russian soldiers have to read Putin's article that he wrote about, one Russia, one Ukraine. All of this ties together to create that Russia has been inciting genocide and that there's a serious risk of genocide.
And so, Yona, look, correct me if I'm wrong, but it normally takes years for any case of this magnitude to be litigated. And from what I can remember, only happens after the conflict is essentially over. I want you to listen, though, to what President Zelensky said just overnight. Have a listen to this.
Cities and communities closer to the Russian border, in Donetsk, in Luhansk, they gather everyone they can to fill the place of those killed and wounded in the occupation contingent. All this, including the deportation of our people and the mass killings of civilians, is an obvious policy of genocide pursued by Russia.
An obvious policy of genocide that is taking place right now in the Donbass area. I mean, if this is happening right now, what are the realistic legal means to prevent it? What can states or geopolitical actors do at this stage? Because this really goes to the heart of your report here.
Yeah, so it's an important point, and I think what he's getting at is, like Emily was saying, there's an incitement campaign that's been engaged in from the top in Russia. And this is all happening against a backdrop of heightened restrictions on media, bans on foreign media, bans on social media, new criminal laws that will sanction certain discussions around the war. So this allows for the Russian officials and state media to more directly filter the message that this war was based on, which is to fight against the Nazis in Ukraine. And as the war has progressed, that has gone on to broadly characterize a majority and substantial group, if not entire generation of Ukrainians as Nazis and an existential threat, which carries an even deeper meaning in the Russian context, because this conditions the public to both condone and commit atrocities that they see as necessary and defensive, because the more they repeat the lie that this war is based on, the more it becomes true for the audience if it's the only message they are hearing. And so this is the kind of policy of genocide that we have documented and we have determined. So we as legal experts and historians and genocide experts, we have simply looked at all the available evidence and the facts, and we've determined that actually there is two breaches. One is incitement to genocide and an intent to destroy the Ukrainian group in part, which is a reasonable ground to conclude that there is genocide taking place as well. We definitively conclude that there is a serious risk of genocide.
Yona Diamond and Emily Prey, really appreciate you both taking the time. I wish we had more time, plenty for us to talk about. Really appreciate it. Very important report. Thank you both.